And now I'll hand you over to Nigel.
Right, thanks very much, Naomi. So we're going to do a virtual tour of the building stones of King's College Chapel. Let me show you what we're aiming to get through. So this is the plan. The central part of what I'm going to say is on King's Chapel. Had a complicated building history, several phases. So we'll go through that and see how you can see those phases, or several of them, in the building stones. But this wouldn't mean much in isolation, I think. So we're going to first of all look at more typical medieval buildings in Cambridge and see what they were built of. And then after I've talked about King's, I'm going to forestall some of the questions I might get asked, which was where did this stone come from and how was it transported to Cambridge? So we'll look at that. And then finally, if we've got time, I want to look at what came next, and did the building of King's Chapel in terms of the materials it was built of actually create a precedent for what went next in Cambridge College building particularly. I should say I come from the Department of Earth Sciences, the geology department in Cambridge. This isn't what I've been studying all my career. I've only really taken it up seriously in retirement. Now, I've had an amateur interest in this for all my career. And some of it will hopefully be published fairly soon, but isn't at the moment. Right, let's start off by first of all looking at the buildings mostly which we can't see. I want to make the point that most medieval buildings in Cambridge are not typical. They weren't built of stone and therefore they didn't survive. So even good quality buildings were built of wooden box frame construction like this one here. The gaps between the structural timbers were filled in with lath and plaster, or wattle and daub. Here you can see laths of wood with the plaster sticking to it. Or they were built of even more rudimentary materials, just mud essentially. Chalk-rich mud, chalk cob or clay lump. And these buildings did not have a long survival time. They were roofed, a lot of medieval buildings, by thatch. That can be replaced obviously, but it was not uncommon for thatch to catch fire and these buildings would be burnt to the ground. Thatch was finally banned in Cambridge in the 1600s because it was a major threat in urban environments. So we're going to be looking at buildings that have survived built of stone. If you're going to use stone, then the first thing, the natural recourse, is to use local stone, because as we'll see later on in the talk, that makes it far cheaper because you don't have to transport it very far. And these two quarries are two from which some of the local stone, or our only good bedrock stone, came. This quarry you can see still at Cherry Hinton. It isn't the medieval quarry, that's just over the other side of the road with the caravan park in it. But this is a sequence of chalk, some bands of which are hard enough to last a fair bit of time, maybe up to a century in buildings. We call that Clunch, or that's the quarryman's term for this hard, durable chalk. This is a picture, as it used to look, of the Barrington chalk pit, the Barrington Cement Works chalk pit. Much of this has been filled in now, and again there were layers of harder clunch in that. So there was one sort of building stone. The second local source of stone was what we call field stone. It was simply cobbles that were harvested from local fields. Indeed, they were the residue when you ploughed fields and you chucked out the hard bits getting in the way of the plough, and this is what you got. And they had a saleable value, and they were moved in many cartloads into Cambridge for building made very difficult building material, clearly, or for paving streets and roads. And you can see a lot of this stuff around at the present day. So looking at how it was actually used in buildings or walls anyway, here's a good example of surviving Clunch at the bottom of this wall. It's the garden wall between King's College and Clare College. This is seen from the King's side, and the bottom half of that wall is white Clunch, as you can see, looking a bit worse for wear over the centuries. That has actually lasted probably without replacement since the Middle Ages. Here's an example where it's used in a proper house. This is the oldest domestic house in Cambridge, probably the School of Pythagoras in St John's College grounds now. And the upper parts of the wall here are made of Clunch. Some of those blocks have probably been replaced over the years. It's difficult to tell how many times. And then here's fieldstone used in a building. This is St Peter's Church up above above Kettle's Yard and the Folk Museum, and you can see the cobbled fieldstone walls. Now, in both these buildings, you'll see that other stone is involved, because neither Clunch nor fieldstone works very well at the corners of buildings. You can see it'd be almost impossible to make a corner out of fieldstone. So imported stone was used at some cost to create the coins, the cornerstones or buttresses here in the School of Pythagoras, or the other exposed bits like these string courses, the horizontal units. And Barnack came. Oh, I'm sorry. I should say the other stone in this building and in the middle of this wall is another imported stone. We'll call it Ragstone. It's often not quite clear which quarry it came from, but it's rather shaly, elongate slabs of low quality stone which can be made into these rubble walls. So a close-up of these. This is the stone that's used in the buttresses there at School of Pythagoras. It comes from a quarry in Barnack, or just the south of Barnack village, just on the outskirts more or less of Stamford. This stone's also used in the oldest surviving stone building in Cambridge, St Bennetts Church, and it's used for the coins here and the string courses and even the windows. And you'll see that St Bennet's is made of essentially ragstone. Now we're not sure where that stuff came from. It could well have come from lower quality stone within the Barnack quarries, although it could have come from the Peterborough area, the so-called Cornbrash. Here's what the Barnack quarries look like now. Barnack stone, and this is significant to King's Chapel, ran out in 1460. The good quality stone, the freestone, that is the stone that you could cut and work to a smooth surface, that ran out in 1460, and this is what was left, a series of hills and holes, so-called. It's a botanical site of special scientific interest now. Now, before we leave medieval buildings, we should just recognise that many of those rubble walls, whether they're made of ragstone or of fieldstone, didn't look like that in the Middle Ages, almost certainly. They looked like this. They were rendered and lime washed, so that you had a white church. The stone in the buttresses would often be left unrendered, but this is what medieval churches would have looked like. This is the part of St Michael's Church, or Michael House Cafe as you might know it now, which is in Keys College, St Michael's Court. But you can see that many other rubble walls in medieval buildings were rendered. This is bits of render sticking to the rubble wall of St Mary's Church, Stourbridge, what you might know as the Leper Chapel. Barnack coins here, and Rubble Walls. And there was clearly a fashion for white churches at that time, and I haven't been able to exactly pin down what the reason for that was. And if anybody knows, I'd be very glad to know. It survives in some parts of the country. Here down in Devon, here's a white church. It's particularly conspicuous when the tower is white. The Isle of Man, where I've done some geological work, is another place where white churches are still in fashion. Again, we'll see that this aspiration to have a white church is relevant to kings. Before we leave these, if you like, typical medieval stone buildings, we should look at what they were roofed in. And I've mentioned thatch, which is one possibility. Clay tiles is another, although the craft of brickmaking more or less died out after the Romans left, and it was only resurrected in the 1400s as far as it applies to Cambridge. Clay tiles probably were being made, and we see lots of roofs of clay tiles now. One of the problems with roofs is you can't put a date on them because there's been a lot of re-roofing of every building over the centuries, so we can't date these tiles very easily. The other sort of roofing material, medieval roofing material, was stone slates. Now, we don't have a source of proper slates, as in metamorphic rock created by pressure on the rock during mountain building, like the Welsh slates that we're so familiar with on most Victorian terraces in Cambridge. But we do have limestones which split along the depositional bedding, the horizontal planes in the rock, often because these limestones have got a little bit of mica, the mineral mica, which is a flaky mineral, in them, and they split into slabs about 1 centimetre thick. And this is an example on the roof of Old Court, Clare College. It doesn't look like that anymore. We've just recently, I say we, this is my college, and we've just at some expense re-roofed the whole of the North Range, and it now looks like this. You'll notice it's got bluey patches in it. That will weather with time and all turn into a yellow roof again, but at the moment it is at least watertight and looks very fine. So just to sum up really about surviving medieval buildings, most of them have rubble walls with Barnack stone dressings, if it's pre-1460. This is St Andrew's Church, Girton, many other examples that you could pick out locally. What we don't see as much, in fact these are I think the only 2 examples that I've come across, is Barnack stone used for walling as what we call ashlar. Ashlar is smoothed stone which is cut and then scraped or ground to a flat surface and used like building bricks to form this smooth surface. So this is the round church. It's been rebuilt by the Victorians, so it probably looked like this in the Middle Ages. And this is the original chancel of the Leper Chapel. But it was not a common use of stone. It was not least because it was probably rather expensive. So with that in mind, let's turn to King's Chapel now. And what was innovative for Cambridge in King's Chapel was the extensive use now of ashlar rather than rubble walling. So there is no rubble in King's Chapel. You can see that those bits of the walls which aren't filled with windows are made of smoothed stone, ashlar. And the other innovation was that there were new limestones used in the chapel. So 4 or 5 innovations really, because there is no Clunch or Barnack stone used externally anyway in King's Chapel. There's probably some Clunch filling in the cores of the walls, but you can't see it either inside or outside. And the Barnack stone had run out by then, so that that was no longer available. At least, well, King's Chapel started to be built in 1446. Barnack was on its way out. There had only been low quality Barnack stone being available. So the builders looked elsewhere. And where they looked was Yorkshire. Here's Yorkminster. Now, this was not coincidental. You'd think this was not a logical place to get good building stone from. It must have been very costly to get it from Yorkshire to Cambridge. Why not get more stone from the quarries fairly close to Barnack? Well, I'll deal with the costs of this later on, but there was a completely separate stylistic reason why the Yorkshire stone was used. It was a magnesian limestone from Yorkshire of Permian age, about 20 kilometres west of York, and it was a very pure white stone. And Henry VI, whose project King's College was, and King's College Chapel in particular, and who laid down the specifications really for King's College Chapel, he very much wanted a white church like Yorkminster. We have to remember that when these buildings were just finished, the stone would have been almost polished. It's quite an old limestone. It's older than the Jurassic limestones, which make up most of Cambridge buildings. And because it's older and the grains are better cemented together, they take a polish, not quite as good as marble, but still quite impressive. So Henry VI wanted one of these white churches. That was his vision for King's College Chapel. And we'll see this was frustrated by events. If you look at anywhere around the outside of King's Chapel, you'll see that the lower levels are made of this white magnesian limestone. Here at the west end, it's very visible because it only goes up about to eye level. And then there is a sharp boundary between that stone and a yellower stone above. You can see it in a slightly more patchy way at the east end. Here you can see in one of the towers the white stone below, and then the white stone and the yellow stone were sort of interleaved. Blocks were constructed almost randomly. This is because the yellower stone was not that yellow when they were using it. It would have been whiter, and the distinction to the builders would not have been so obvious. They would not have perhaps envisaged that it would look so obviously patchy as it does now. So there we have this boundary between white and yellow stones. The yellow stones are Jurassic stones. We'll come to that in a minute. From, as I say, close to Barnack, from what we call the Lincolnshire limestone belt, although it's not all in Lincolnshire. You can see this boundary on the north and south elevations of the chapel too. So it's not that easy to see when the sun is fully out. It sort of bleaches all the rocks, but you can see the lower levels here, particularly the buttresses. You can see the lower levels are white, but the upper levels are yellow, and that's the line of the join. And that is the level to which building had proceeded in the first phase of building until 1461. And what happened in 1461? Well, we have to remember that the chapel was being built pretty much during the Wars of the Roses, and Henry VI, who was from the House of Lancaster, was deposed in 1461, and building work stopped. So that line is a major event in the history of building of the chapel, but it's a major event nationally. This is recorded in this colour change. Just to look at the different phases of building of the chapel, This is a timeline, 1440 to 1520, and the bars here represent times when we know building stone was being supplied to the chapel. There are quite good records of payments made for stone, and this is when the stone was arriving in Cambridge. So there are long gaps here in the buff colour where there was no stone being delivered at all, and presumably if building work was going on, which it might have been, it was only on a very small scale, using up stocks of already accumulated stone. And here are the stones themselves at the left-hand side, the magnesian limestone, which I've talked about, from 3 quarries in Yorkshire, which supplied the earlier phase, a little bit in the very last phase of building. And these are the 4 stones from the Lincolnshire limestone, which were mostly used during the 2nd and 3rd phases, and a little bit from Kingscliff quarry, which was delivered at the end of the 1st phase, and might have been used before then. Here are the monarchs through the Wars of the Roses. So I've divided that into 3 phases of building. They've been called the sort of Lancastrian phase, Henry VI, the Yorkist phase, though the Yorkist kings were not as keen on the project as Henry had been. So a little bit of work got going again towards the end of the Yorkist phase. And then the Tudors, again, Henry VII wasn't very enthusiastic about it, only very late in his reign. I'm not quite clear why that was. And it was Henry VIII who finished the chapel off. So let's look at the stones that succeeded on the magnesian limestone here at the West End again. And we've seen the 1461 line. You can see there's another line at the West End of the chapel here. It's just through there. Below that line, the stone is yellower, and above it's a paler yellow. It'll be more obvious if I artificially just deepen up the colours a little bit. There we go, and you can see the yellow blocks are mostly below this line. There are a few which have been interspersed up here. Again, we can't always be sure that some of these weren't later repairs. The west window is also apparently made of yellower stone. So clearly 2 different sorts of stone. I think that this is the Clipsham stone. We know that stone was delivered from Clipsham, just north of Stamford. That is a yellowish shelly limestone. And the lighter stone up the top is certainly from Weldon, which is just on the outskirts of Corby, really, down in Northamptonshire. So those are the distinction between those 2 stones is fairly clear at the West End. Elsewhere in the chapel, it's not quite so clear, not least because, of course, you can't get up. Well, I can't get up to see these externally, unless there was any scaffolding. The Weldon stone is easily recognised because it's a light coloured stone and it has little holes in it. You can see here it's got these holes which are, when we enlarge them, they're little gaps in the shells. It's where the original seashells here have not been completely filled by the sand-sized grains, which are little spheres called ooids, all made of calcium carbonate of limestone material. The Clipsham stone doesn't have those holes, you can see. So we can use geological parameters to tell these stones apart. There's been a puzzle about one of the other stones in the chapel, this stone from Kingscliff, which we know was delivered, at least 1 batch of it, at the end of the 1st phase, and where was it used? And architectural historians have not been quite sure. They've suspected that it was used in the side chapels to the north, and indeed I've been able to convince myself that that's the case. If you go through this door out of the choir, into the north side of the chapel. This is where the public displays are. You can actually get to see them again now. So into those side chapels, and then you see a very distinctive stone from Kingscliff, which has this rather dirty looking lamination in it. It's the depositional bedding here, but it has this light and dark striping, which is well, attractive to some, but it's not the most easy on the eye, perhaps, this stone. Now, it's not, as I say, it's not been quite clear whether this is Kingscliff or not, but I've looked around at all the other examples in Cambridge where it's thought to have been used, and of course, most logically in Kingscliff itself, where it's been used locally. It didn't get exported very far away, but in Kingscliff village, there's any number of buildings right up into Victorian times made of this Kingscliff stone. The match is very good. The quarries themselves, of course, and this is one of the frustrations for me, is most of the medieval quarries are now no longer available. At Kingscliff, there's a set of hills and holes, if you like, along the quarry belt, but no faces of rock to be looked at. So, following on with what was happening during the later phases. Oh, I should say, sorry, before we leave that, it's quite clear that Kingscliff stone was available for the building of more or less all the northern side chapels. And it was therefore available not just at the end of the first phase of building, but probably for most of the first phase. And there must have been deliveries of this stone earlier on than just the last couple of years. So as building got going again in the second and third phases, you see even internally the break between the white foundations, if you like, of the Magnesian limestone and darker Jurassic limestones above, the Lincolnshire limestone. And in particular, the vaulting is of this lighter coloured Weldon stone. And thankfully, it's all in one colour. There was no mixing and matching of the yellow and white stones there. We think of this as very special, this vaulting, and so it is, but it's not without precedent. The builder of this, the master mason, John Wastell, had only a few years before built this. This is the east end, the so-called new building, 1500, of Peterborough Cathedral. And it's on a smaller scale, but the vaulting is remarkably similar. It doesn't take a professional to look at the designs there and to work out this came from the same workshop. So that not only do the styles match, but I was delighted to find, I went to Peterborough recently, that this vaulting and the whole of the new building is made of Weldon stone, added on to the main cathedral, which is all of Barnack. So Wastell, in a way, used Peterborough as a test run for King's College Chapel. So now, summing up the innovations that King's Chapel displayed. So we've seen that there's ashlar walling rather than rubble walling, and then 5 novel limestones. The one I haven't mentioned. Magnesian limestone we've mentioned, the white stone at the base, 3 different sorts of Jurassic limestones, which we can tell apart to some extent. And then there's a 5th limestone recorded as having been delivered from somewhere called Hasselborough. Now, Hasselborough doesn't exist on any maps now. Place name enthusiasts have found it extremely difficult to pin down. And there is just one record of Hasselborough stone being delivered elsewhere to, I think, as I remember, Louth Church. And it was delivered along with stone from Haydor Quarry, which is in the Ancaster area of Lincolnshire, just next door to Sleaford. And so the assumption is that Hasselborough stone was from this Ancaster region. It would certainly have been illogical to move stone to Louth from somewhere further south than the more southern quarries in the Jurassic belt. So that's probably where it came from. The problem is that Ancaster is very easily recognisable to a geologist. It has a different sort of light, dark banding, and I've not certainly seen any of that banding in King's Chapel. So we have to put a question mark against that. It's recorded as having been delivered, but until anybody actually finds it in the chapel, then the jury is out. So let's take a little excursion to look at where this stone came from and how it got to Cambridge. Particularly, was it extremely extravagant to bring stone from Yorkshire to Cambridge for this vanity project of Henry VI? Well, here's a map of Eastern England. It's a geological map. It shows in different colours the main stone belts. In green here, the chalk, the Clunch, if you like, with the three main areas of supply of Clunch to Cambridge. In the middle, in yellow, is the Jurassic stone belt, the uplands that you would drive over as you got to Stamford, the Stamford area. It's enlarged over here, and there are the quarries we've been talking about. Weldon, where most of the upper part of King's Chapel came from, Kingscliff here, Collie Weston slates we've mentioned, Barnack, the original supply for Cambridge, Clipsham here, and then Ancaster, some way north, where possibly Hasselborough came from. About, on the whole, about 50 miles from Cambridge. About double that distance are the magnesian limestone quarries. Three of them, Thievesdale, Huddleston and Hampole. How did they get that stone to Cambridge? Well, the Yorkshire stone, here on a drainage map of Eastern England, so the blue lines are drainage, got to Cambridge by this route. Here's Thievesdale, Huddleston, Hampole. They were transported by cart or by possibly canal boat from Thievesdale and Huddleston to the River Ouse down to the Humber, or from Hampole to the Don. They were probably transshipped to seagoing boats at the old port of Airmen. They came by sea out from the Humber, past Gibraltar Point here down to King's Lynn at this point here, and then they would have had to be transshipped again into smaller boats to come up the Great Ouse and to Cambridge on the Cap. The transport routes for the Jurassic stones were, well, these are closer, but the transport routes are no less complicated. This is a medieval drainage map, if you like. It lacks the large northeast southwest drainage channels which were dug mostly in the 1600s and which have totally changed this drainage pattern now. Here are the quarries. Here in blue are the documented wharves where stone was loaded or where goods were loaded. Sometimes the high point of navigation, like Stamford on the River Welland or Wansford on the Nene, were not used because tolls were charged at those wharves, whereas tolls were not charged where the river was tidal, still tidal, so they might have been loaded. A lot of stone came out of Gunwade here, which it was the height of tides on the Nene. So whatever, these stones would have to be got by cart to those ports, and then they came on complex routes through the fens. They came on routes something like this, though we can't be sure of the exact routes through the fens. So down the Welland or down the Nene, and then on these cross-fen channels which linked up with the ooze and finally down the ooze and back up the cam here. Now, these channels were maintained often by the medieval abbeys, who again charged tolls probably for their use, and they were not always open. The records are not good enough to say how persistent these routes were. If they were not available, then stone would have to go a more lengthy route. It would have to go out down the glen or the welland or the Nene and out into the wash, and then back in again via Lynn up the ooze. I've drawn rather vague route across the wash. This is a treacherous area of sandbanks, and you would not be able to quite do that route. But you've got to bear in mind that in the Middle Ages, the coastline was further south. These dashed lines are estimates of where the medieval coastline would be, and the fen terrain, it's really a delta building out into the wash. So the coastline is moving northwards all the time. So those were the routes which we think stone came, and we need that to make an estimate of how much it cost to move stone to Cambridge. This is a survey of costs of stone during the Middle Ages and Tudor times gives this estimate, all converted to old pence, if you remember those, some of us, per tonne per mile. So this is what it cost to move a tonne of stone 1 mile. It cost 5p to move it by road, very expensive. It cost only 1 penny to move it by inland water, which is the main mode of transport. And it cost half that again, a halfpenny, to move 1 tonne 1 mile by coastal shipping. So these can inform an estimate of costs, and that's what I've done here. It's slightly simpler, hopefully, to understand than it looks at first sight. Here's the cost on the left-hand side, simply in old pennies per tonne. And we need to compare that perhaps with the cost of the stone. The cost of stone, again, 1600 prices, was something like 70p per tonne. And you'll see immediately that the cost of transport, which is the top of these bars, was not just a substantial part of the whole enterprise, but the majority of the enterprise. It cost almost twice as much to transport stone as it did to actually buy it at the quarry gate. So let's take these in groups. Here at the right-hand side are the 3 Clunch quarries. And you can see why that stone was used. It's so cheap, it's local. At the other end are the 3 Yorkshire quarries, and you can see those have a green sector in here. Those are the sector for coastal boat transport, and that, of course, those are half the height they would be if they were being moved by inland water. So that makes transport from Yorkshire relatively cheap, cheaper than you would think, and you'll see it's of a comparable cost to a lot of the Lincolnshire limestone quarries, which are the ones in the middle. Of those, Barnack here, 2 columns for Barnack, 1 by transport via the Welland, 1 via the Nene, but however you play it, that's quite cheap. It's more expensive if you have to go out into the wash, which is the dashed bits here. And then Clipsham stone here. Ancaster is more expensive further north. What is surprising is that Weldon is quite expensive. Weldon, which was used for the later phases, is even by the cross-fen route, is essentially the same cost as the magnesian limestone had been. So you can draw from that what you like. It was an expensive project, King's Chapel, but it was not so much of an extravagance to bring in this magnesian limestone. So let's go to the last phase now and just look at what came next after King's. Of the innovations of King's Chapel, first of all, the extensive ashlar. Surprisingly, ashlar walling was not used again for at least a century in Cambridge colleges. It was probably too expensive for the average college to afford. Of the various novel limestones used, Magnesian limestone was never used again in Cambridge. Kingscliff was used very sparingly until the 1600s, and then fell out of use, probably, well, because better stones, more attractive stones became available. Clipsham and Hazelborough were not used again until Victorian times, because partly, I think, because of the cost of transport. And the only stone which was used in King's Chapel, which did become a favourite, was Weldon stone, and that was widely used right up into the 20th century till after the Second War, when the quarries finally became disused. So what was going on in terms of college building during and after construction of King's Chapel? Well, the answer is brick. I mentioned that the craft of brickmaking had been revived in the 1400s, and this is the earliest extensive use of brick in Queens, with windows made of Clunch and Barnack windowsills, which was still available, not in very good quality. Here's another brick building in the old schools. This was the University Centre, the red wall, the lower part of this building. The top is a Victorian addition. And then here's Magdalen. We could take a lot of examples. Now, Magdalen was built after Barnack ran out, so the windows in Magdalen are Weldon stone. Weldon stone itself, the best place to see it is in Great St Mary's Church. You can see it right down at eye level here, and there is a little bit of Weldon ashlar, as there is in the gatehouse to Christ's, which seems to be Weldon. But those are the only examples of Weldon ashlar, I think. It's mostly used as dressings, that is window frames, door frames, string courses, buttresses. Nowhere more extensively than in Jesus. Jesus College has always used Weldon right through to the 20th century in all its buildings. Here, even into the 17th century, the 1600s, brick was still the dominant building material to start with. And here's an example from Pembroke. This is the Pembroke Street side of Ivy Court. But here, significantly, with a new stone, a new kid on the block, these windows are made of Ketton stone from Rutland, from just west of Stamford. And this is a beautiful, even textured stone with no shells in it. It's just made of these little 1 millimeter snowballs of carbonate mud called ooids. And it's the most beautiful stone to work, and it takes carvings very well. And once it was discovered, and it really hadn't been used much before the 1600s, even in Ketton, as far as I can see, Ketton Church is made of barnack. So people discovered this stone, and it became the overwhelming favourite compared with, say, Weldon, which is much more shelly. And the culmination, really, or the outburst of popularity of Ketton is seen in two colleges. Clare, I have to say, Old Court is built of Ketton stone, and very fine it looks too, and less conspicuously but equally attractive, maybe even built, some say perhaps by the same architect, is Christ's Fellows building, about the same time as building was started in Clare. And this arrival of Ketton finally set the fashion for ashlar in college buildings. To round it off, of course, King's itself was not building during this period. The big court, the first court, front court, whatever it's called, at King's, was only completed first of all in the 1700s by the Gibbs building, in Portland stone, white Portland stone, and then by Wilkins building in the 1800s, made of Ketton. And the final side was closed by Wilkins with the screen again in Ketton stone. So Kings succumbed to the Ketton fashion. Well, that's the end of what I want to say. I hope you'll look at King's Chapel with new eyes when you can get round to see it. At the moment, I think you can only get inside and you can't wander around outside, where you could go and see some of these features for yourselves. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Nigel, so much for that really interesting presentation. We've had a couple of questions come in while you were speaking, so I'll go ahead and ask those out loud, if that's okay.
Sure.
So the first one is from Nikki, who wants to know, is it known if stone was offloaded at quayside or could be taken further along to the river to the back of Kings? And she's also asked, was the stone cut to size at the quarries or on site? We have some records of stone being unloaded at quayside, but it's not usually recorded for even where counts are very extensive, like in King's Chapel. I may be wrong, but I don't recall costs for carriage of stone from quayside to King's being recorded in the King's accounts, but I stand to be corrected on that. It would be perfectly logical to just move the stone right up to a temporary quay at King's. That would save costs. It was already on a perfectly suitable boat. You probably know that you couldn't move boats up that part of the river using horses on the bank. There's no towpath, but the horses famously walked up the middle of the river where there's a hard causeway. So there were certainly means of getting boats up the river. So yes, that's something. It either could be true, and we don't know that. Sorry, what was the second half of the question, Nelly? The second part was the stone cut to size at quarries or on site?
Yeah, again, sometimes that's recorded. So sometimes the accounts say that stone was ordered as dressed, already dressed. But we certainly know that quite a bit of stone was transported just in rough blocks from the quarry, and it was worked on site. We know that because there's one celebrated record of blocks of stone being transported across Whittlesea Mere, the lake, on this cross-fen transport route, and the boat sinking and the stone ending up on the bottom of the lake. And when that lake was drained, there were these big blocks of Barnack stone, and they're still there. They're preserved as a monument in the middle of whatever it is, home fen, and you can see that those are unworked. They've got mason's marks on or quarryman's marks on, but no, they haven't been worked, except just to roughly shape them to a roughly cuboidal form. So I think both transport mechanisms were possible, and so it is at the present day. I was at the quarry gate, and I was literally at the quarry gate of Clipsham Holywell quarry yesterday, and lorries were leaving both with worked stone and with rough stone. So although I get the impression now most stone is delivered already dressed to building sites in Cambridge.
Thank you. The next question is from Reg, who says, was the Totterhoe stone from Burwell used for decorative work internally in the chapel?
Now, as I said that there's no Clunch visible, I almost stopped myself because I thought, well, probably there is some carving done in Clunch, but and I must say I haven't specially examined the internal stone in King's, but if there is Clunch there, I couldn't point you to it. All the vaulting and the windows are all in Weldon. There is the decorated internal sides of the chapels in the antechapel
at the side chapels, and that's done partly in Weldon and partly in Stone, it is said, which is a carvable Jurassic limestone from France. So I'm not sure that there is Clunch, though Clunch is widely used internally in churches in Cambridge and Cambridgeshire because it doesn't weather and decay internally. So most, I would venture to say, most medieval churches in Cambridge have got internal work in Clunch, for which it's perfectly suitable.
Okay, the next question was from Alex, who asks, where are the Cambridge examples of the reuse of stone from dissolved monastic buildings? Okay,
the most conspicuous example, I think, is in Caius College, in Caius Court, which is what you see, or you would see if you were very tall, if you walk down Senate House Passage. So walk down towards Trinity Hall, and on the right, past the first bit, which is Victorian, then you come to very obviously reused stone, and that came from, I can't remember which Fenland Abbey, it might have been Thorney, but it's obviously reused. It is Barnack as well, because if you look at the blocks, they have got a rectangular profile, but a lot of the corners and edges are chipped, so that you'll see even in places to fill in the holes where blocks have got chipped corners, there are little insets of extra tiles of stone. So that's all reused, and internally, when the time comes and we get back into Caius to have a look, you'll see that the whole of Caius Court is made of reused Barnack stone. So that's a conspicuous example. Another place, again, if you could get into Trinity Great Court, is the south side of the court, which uses what is said to be Barnack from Cambridge Castle. And I just have my doubts. It looks extremely like Kingscliff stone to me, but that's very difficult to prove. So that's another example. Emmanuel, well, I should say there are some examples where colleges have reused stone from the abbey that was on the same site. So Emmanuel is one where you can see reused Barnack. So a number of different examples.
Thank you. Lynn has asked, where do you find the records of stone deliveries?
Right. As I say, the best researched documentary evidence is for King's of all Cambridge colleges, and there are two sources. There is a very readable book by Francis Woodman on the architectural history of King's College Chapel, which has digested a lot of the information and gives it in almost a readable form. There is an almost unreadable longer version. The data was all collected by the former archivist of King's Chapel, of King's College, called John Saltmarsh, and his records, never published, were published posthumously, and are in a thick volume and very small print, which is, I know, available from the King's bookshop, the King's College bookshop on the opposite side of King's Parade. If you really want to read more or less the raw abstracted records, they make very valuable and interesting reading for anybody that's got the time to digest them.
And some powerful glasses, I guess, to see.
Yeah, a magnifying
glass. Okay, we just have one more question from Reg, who has asked, could some of the ragstone on older buildings be upwear coralline rag?
The same thought has occurred to me, Reg, but I've never been able to prove it. I'm no expert on the upwear limestone. I do have a colleague who is, and I need to drag him along and see if we can see any. It's very difficult to tell these ragstones apart. They weather in an unhelpful way. That they get a crust of soot and other dirt of time on them, so that it makes it difficult to see them, compared with ashlar walls, which are relatively smooth. And of course, one thing you can't do with a grade 1 listed building is take your geological hammer along and chip a bit off, so that it's not easy to tell these rocks apart. It is the nearest source of ragstone, if you like, and it would be not at all illogical for some of it to have been brought upriver from upwhere. The literature says that ragstone mostly came from Barnack, but I've looked quite a bit in the Peterborough area at the Cornbrash, which is the local lower quality building stone around Peterborough, and I think there's quite a bit of Cornbrash in Cambridge, but that's another sizable study to look at the source of this ragstone.
So there's still a few mysteries to be unraveled there.
Yeah.
Well, that's our last question that's been entered into the chat already. So I'll go ahead and thank everyone so much for coming to this event this afternoon. We really appreciate it. And we're really excited about the rest of Open Cambridge this weekend. This is one of our first ever purely digital events, so we would love to have your feedback on it. And my colleague Hannah has posted a link to a feedback survey in the chat window. So if you don't mind taking a moment to fill that out, that would be great. We would really appreciate it. And we really hope you enjoy the rest of Open Cambridge this weekend. Please check out our website for more details on the events and activities that we have going on. Again, there's a link to that in the chat window already for you. Thanks so much. And thank you, Nigel, for taking the time out of your schedule to talk to us.
Thanks everybody for coming.